What would you do if someone shot your child just because they were different? It's a question no parent should ever have to face, but for one family, this became their reality. Their daughter, born with disabilities that set her apart from other children, became the target of an individual's unexplainable cruelty. A woman, known to many as a Karen, who lived in their neighborhood, crossed every line imaginable when she took matters into her own hands in the most violent and shocking way. The incident, which occurred in broad daylight, wasn't just an isolated attack. It was a consequence of an ongoing, simmering tension within their community, specifically with the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that was meant to protect their rights. Instead of offering help or support, the HOA became a battleground, setting the stage for one of the most heart-wrenching moments this family would ever endure. The woman's twisted justification? She claimed that she was just teaching her a lesson. Can you imagine hearing those words? That your child suffering her injury was nothing more than a lesson in someone else's eyes. The family's pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply traumatic. Their daughter, who had always been seen as different, now became the victim of someone's sense of entitlement and cruelty. How could a mother possibly find the courage to look at her disabled child and claim such heartless words? This is the story of a family fighting not just for justice, but for the dignity of their child, who, despite the world's harsh treatment, deserves to be seen and loved for who she truly is. As this story unfolds, we will reveal the shocking twists and turns that no one could have predicted. The emotional toll it took on the family, the lengths they went to in order to seek justice, and the uncovering of dark secrets within their community will leave you questioning how far the abuse of power can go, and just how far someone will go to defend their child. Make sure you stay till the end of the video, because the real truth will leave you speechless. Before the shooting, the family's life was what anyone would consider ordinary or perhaps even peaceful. They had learned to navigate their daily struggles, especially with their daughter's disability, but they were united and strong. Their little girl had never been like other children, but they loved her all the more for it. Her unique challenges required extra care, attention, and patience. The family had always made sure to shield her from the harshness of the world. They kept their circle small, their hearts bigger, and their home a safe haven. The community where they lived had seemed like the perfect place for a family to thrive. Quiet, serene, and peaceful until that peace was shattered. It all began with the Homeowners Association. At first, the family didn't think much of it. The HOA had always been something in the background, a set of rules and regulations that seemed to have little impact on their lives. They didn't give much attention to the occasional letters or the strict notices about property upkeep, as they always maintained their house in accordance with the guidelines. But then, Karen, the woman from the HOA, began to take a personal interest in their family. Her visits were brief but pointed, often making subtle remarks about the family's daughter. She called her troublesome and an inconvenience because of the noise and sometimes erratic behavior that came with her disability. At first, the family tried to brush it off. After all, not everyone understood their situation, and they didn't want to make waves in a community that had seemed so perfect up until that point. But the tensions slowly started to grow. Karen's visits became more frequent, her comments more pointed. What began as casual complaints soon turned into full-blown accusations, all centered on the daughter. Karen started rallying others in the neighborhood against them, calling for stricter enforcement of the HOA rules. She even started taking matters into her own hands, reporting minor, often irrelevant issues to the HOA, which would then issue notices to the family. It was as if Karen had made it her personal mission to target them, and the stress began to weigh on the family. The daughter, once oblivious to the tension, began noticing the cold stares and whispers. She didn't understand why people who had once been friendly toward her family were now avoiding them or speaking behind their backs. It was heartbreaking for the parents, who had always strived to protect their daughter from such cruelty. They tried to assure her that everything would be fine, that some people just didn't understand, but deep down, they knew it wasn't true. They were beginning to realize that their perfect, peaceful community was anything but. And then came the day that everything changed. It started like any other, with the family going about their routine. The daughter was outside, playing with her toys, laughing, her usual carefree self. But that peaceful moment would soon be interrupted in the most horrific way. Karen, who had been lurking in the background, watching from her porch as she often did, saw an opportunity. She didn't just see a disabled child playing in the yard. She saw an opportunity to make a point. Her frustration, her anger, and her misguided sense of authority all came to a head in an instant. The family had no idea that this was coming. They had no idea that the calm they had come to rely on was only an illusion. The storm had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. What Karen did that day would not only change the family's life forever, but would also expose the dark side of a community that claimed to uphold the ideals of safety and respect. It was a day that no one in that neighborhood would ever forget. The tragic events that followed would unravel everything they thought they knew about their neighbors, their community, and the lengths to which one woman would go to assert control. From that moment, the family's fight for justice had begun. What started as a small, isolated issue with an HOA member would soon spiral into a legal and emotional battle that would test their strength and their resolve. They had no idea that they were about to face not only the trauma of the shooting, but the shocking realization of what people were capable of when they felt they could wield power over others. And so, the family's journey into a fight for justice, dignity, and the safety of their child began, with the world looking on, unsure of what would come next. The tension that had been simmering for months finally came to a head one fateful afternoon when Karen decided to confront the family directly. Up until then, her actions had been subtle, petty complaints and quiet whisperings behind closed doors. But now, she was ready to make her presence felt, and the confrontation she had been building toward was nothing short of explosive. It started with a knock on the door. The family, not expecting any visitors, was caught off guard. Standing on the doorstep was Karen, her expression cold, her posture rigid. Without preamble, she started listing complaints, one after another, all focused on their daughter. From the noise she made while playing in the yard to the way she sometimes wandered around the property, Karen claimed it was a disturbance to the neighborhood. The HOA expects families like yours to adhere to the rules, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. I've had multiple complaints, and frankly, it's becoming unbearable for everyone. The parents, taken aback by the attack, tried to explain. They told Karen that their daughter's behavior was due to her disability, that she wasn't doing anything wrong. But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes were set, her words unwavering. Your daughter is an inconvenience. People are complaining, and I've had enough of making excuses for her, she snapped. You need to control her, or I'll have to escalate this. The confrontation quickly escalated from an attempt to reason with Karen to a full-blown argument. Karen made it clear that she was no longer interested in compromise or understanding. This was about power. This was about her ability to control the situation. And in her mind, controlling it meant making the family's life as difficult as possible. She had no regard for the fact that their daughter wasn't being disruptive on purpose, no empathy for the struggles they faced every day. What made it worse was that Karen wasn't acting alone. The HOA, which was supposed to be an impartial body ensuring the well-being of the community, was now aligned with her. The family had been receiving notices, threatening letters, and fines for things that no one had ever raised an issue with before. Karen, it seemed, had rallied enough support to gain power within the association. The family quickly realized that this wasn't just one woman on a power trip. It was a coordinated effort by the HOA to force them out, to make them conform to standards that were unrealistic and unfair, especially considering their daughter's needs. As the argument continued, Karen's attitude grew more hostile. She didn't care about the family's explanations, didn't care about their daughter's disability. She just wanted to make them feel powerless. She began making threats, telling them that if they didn't take care of the problem, the HOA would be forced to take legal action. You don't have a choice, she said coldly. You'll either follow the rules or face consequences. The family, already on edge from the constant harassment, tried to remain calm. But the reality was starting to sink in. Their once peaceful home was under siege. What was meant to be a place of safety had become a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't just Karen, it was an entire system that was failing them. That night after Karen left, the family sat together in the living room, processing everything that had just happened. The mother, in particular, was shaken. She had always fought to protect her daughter, but now she realized that no matter how hard she tried to protect her, there would always be people like Karen who would tear down everything they built. The stress, the constant threats, the cruel words, it all started to take a toll on them. They had always been a strong family, but now it seemed like every time they tried to move forward, someone or something was pulling them back. They couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. They never imagined that their simple desire to live peacefully in their own home would lead them into a nightmare. But that was just the beginning. Karen's attempt to intimidate them was just a small piece of the puzzle. Her actions would soon escalate in ways they couldn't have imagined, culminating in a shocking event that would change their lives forever. What seemed like a petty squabble over trivial matters would soon become a fight for justice, a fight to prove that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could treat them this way without facing consequences. The family had no idea what was coming, but one thing was certain: they would not back down. The fight had only just begun. The aftermath of the confrontation was nothing short of devastating. The family had expected the situation to be tense, but they never imagined that it would escalate to the point it did. The day after the argument with Karen, the family was still reeling from the harsh words and the threats. But they never could have anticipated the violence that would soon follow, shattering their sense of security and forcing them into a nightmare that no parent should ever have to face. It started out like any other day. The daughter was playing outside in the safety of her own yard, enjoying the sunshine as she always did. She was unaware of the looming danger, lost in the joy of simple childhood moments. Her parents were inside, trying to gather their thoughts to make sense of everything Karen had said and done. They knew they had to figure out their next steps, but in the back of their minds, they never imagined that things would get worse, that someone could go as far as to harm their daughter. But Karen had made it clear that she was no longer willing to play by the rules. She wasn't interested in dialogue or compromise. She wasn't satisfied with simply controlling the HOA. No, Karen had decided that she would take matters into her own hands. Armed with a weapon and a dangerous sense of entitlement, she made her way to the family's house, ready to carry out her twisted idea of teaching a lesson. The sound of the shot rang out, louder and more horrifying than anything the family had ever heard. It echoed through the neighborhood, silencing everything else in an instant. The mother rushed to the door, her heart racing, only to find her daughter crumpled on the ground, blood staining the grass. The chaos that followed was nothing short of surreal. The mother screamed, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Karen stood there, a cruel, twisted smile playing on her lips. She needed to learn, she said coldly, as if justifying the unspeakable act that she had just committed. She was disturbing the peace. "I'm just teaching her a lesson, like you all should have done a long time ago." The words didn't register at first. How could they? What kind of person could justify shooting a child for simply existing? The family's world turned upside down in that instant. The daughter, their precious little girl, had been shot in the leg, and Karen, of all people, was the one responsible. It was beyond comprehension. The paramedics arrived quickly, but not fast enough. The daughter was rushed to the hospital, her life hanging by a thread. The mother and father could do nothing but sit by her side, helpless and devastated, their hearts shattered into pieces. They couldn't believe what was happening. How had they gone from being a normal family, living peacefully in their own home, to being the victims of such a horrific act? The police were called, but even their presence seemed inadequate in the face of such an incomprehensible situation. Karen was arrested, but the family knew that this was just the beginning. They didn't know how to deal with the emotional and physical trauma their daughter had endured, and the emotional toll on the parents was immeasurable. The shock was overwhelming. What followed was a grueling and heart-wrenching series of medical procedures, emotional breakdowns, and legal battles. The daughter, once a carefree child, now had to learn how to cope with the pain of the shooting and the long road to recovery. She struggled to understand why someone would do such a thing to her, someone who had never done anything wrong. The parents were consumed by guilt, frustration, and disbelief. They couldn't stop asking themselves what had gone wrong. They had tried to protect their daughter, shield her from the cruelty of the world, but they had failed. And now, they were forced to face the harsh reality that their child had been hurt in the most unimaginable way. Karen, on the other hand, showed no remorse. Her justification for the shooting, her belief that she was just teaching the girl a lesson, was chilling. It was clear that she felt no guilt, no empathy. In her mind, the shooting was an unfortunate but necessary act. The family, however, refused to let her actions go unchallenged. This wasn't just about their daughter, it was about standing up to the abuse of power, the cruelty, and the disregard for human dignity that Karen had displayed. As the days went on, the family began to realize that this was no longer just a personal tragedy, it was a fight for justice, a fight to ensure that Karen and others like her would not get away with this kind of violence. But that fight was far from over. The family had just stepped into a much larger battle, one that would test their strength, their resolve, and their belief in what was right. The shooting was only the beginning, and the true battle for justice had only just begun. The shooting of their daughter left the family in a state of shock, but it also ignited a fierce determination to uncover the truth. As they sat in the sterile waiting room of the hospital, the pain of their daughter's injuries still fresh, their minds raced with questions. How could something like this happen? Why had Karen, someone who was supposed to be a neighbor, a member of the same community, resorted to violence? They didn't just want justice, they needed answers. The police investigation began almost immediately. Detectives came and went, asking the family to recount every detail of the events that had led up to the shooting. Their home was combed through for evidence, and Karen's statements were recorded. But as the family soon realized, the investigation wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about navigating a complex web of lies, deceit, and manipulation. Karen, now in police custody, had her own version of events. She maintained that the shooting had been an accident, a misguided attempt to discipline the daughter. Her cold, emotionless tone when explaining the incident only heightened the family's anger. The more they heard from her, the more they understood how calculated and cold-hearted her actions had been. Karen's defense was flimsy at best, but she had a history of stirring trouble in the community, and it seemed as though she was trying to use that to her advantage. She had long positioned herself as a figure of authority in the neighborhood, someone who believed in maintaining order, even if it meant taking extreme measures. The police dug deeper into her background. As they interviewed more neighbors, the picture of Karen's personality and her relationship with the family began to emerge. What they found shocked the family even further. It wasn't just the shooting that had been disturbing, it was the fact that Karen had been orchestrating a campaign of harassment against them for months, if not longer. She had been reporting every minor issue to the HOA, exaggerating the family's shortcomings, and even spreading rumors. It turned out that Karen had a history of using the HOA as her personal weapon, manipulating situations to get her way, all while hiding behind a facade of respectability. The more they learned about Karen, the more the family understood just how much their lives had been impacted by her actions. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a case of systemic abuse, where Karen had used her position in the HOA to control, bully, and intimidate not just the family, but others in the neighborhood. Her behavior had created a toxic environment, one that made the family's life hell before the shooting even took place. But the investigation wasn't just about Karen. It was about the HOA as well. The family had always assumed the association was there to maintain peace and fairness, but now they realized how much influence and power Karen had over it. The detectives soon uncovered troubling information about the HOA's involvement. There were records of complaints, most of them baseless, that had been escalated by Karen to higher levels. The family wasn't the first to be targeted by her manipulations. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how Karen had used the HOA as a tool to isolate, punish, and control those she deemed undesirable. The family's determination to get to the bottom of everything led them to pursue legal action against both Karen and the HOA. They couldn't let this injustice stand. Their daughter's life, her safety, and her future depended on exposing the truth. The family contacted their lawyer, who immediately began working to hold both Karen and the HOA accountable for their actions. The legal process was long, slow, and emotionally draining, but the family pressed on. They knew that every step they took, every piece of evidence they uncovered, brought them closer to the justice their daughter so rightfully deserved. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Karen was not just a rogue individual. She had been enabled by a system that had failed to protect the family, and in many ways, had allowed her to escalate her behavior unchecked. The more the family fought to expose Karen's actions, the more they realized that their fight was not just for their daughter, it was for everyone who had suffered in silence under Karen's reign of terror. They were standing up against an abusive system, one that had allowed power to be abused and lives to be destroyed. As the days passed, the family began to feel the weight of the case settle upon them. They weren't just fighting for justice for their daughter anymore. They were fighting for the integrity of their community, for the safety of every person who lived there, and for the values they believed in. But even as they pushed forward, they knew the battle was far from over. Karen was a formidable opponent, and the HOA's ties to her ran deep. Still, the family stood resolute. They would not back down. The truth would come to light no matter how long it took. The investigation had uncovered a web of lies, manipulation, and deceit, but the family knew that the real fight was just beginning. The emotional toll of the shooting still weighed heavily on them, and the constant barrage of legal paperwork, police reports, and court dates seemed endless. Every day felt like a struggle to hold their family together, but they were determined not to let Karen's cruelty destroy them. As the legal battle began, the family's lawyer worked tirelessly to build a case against Karen, presenting the evidence of her harassment and the violent act she had committed. But the process was grueling. The justice system moved at a glacial pace, and there were moments when the family felt like they were losing their grip. Every court appearance felt like a fresh wound, as they were forced to relive the horror of that day over and over again. Their daughter's recovery was slow, and though she was physically healing, the emotional scars remained. The family tried their best to comfort her, but nothing could fully erase the trauma she had endured. At the heart of their fight was the question of accountability. They couldn't just let Karen walk away from this, not after everything she had done. They had to ensure that she faced the consequences of her actions, not just for their daughter's sake, but for the sake of every family who had ever been harassed, bullied, or threatened by her. The family began to see the larger picture. The more they fought, the more they realized this wasn't just about their daughter. This was about standing up against abuse of power and the culture of fear that had been allowed to flourish under Karen's influence. As the court dates dragged on, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to make things easy. She dug in her heels, insisting that her actions were justified. Her defense attorney painted her as a well-intentioned woman who had simply misunderstood the situation. Karen herself claimed that the shooting was a tragic accident, a momentary lapse in judgment. The family was infuriated by these claims. How could anyone justify what Karen had done? How could she possibly believe that shooting their daughter was anything less than a deliberate act of violence? The courtroom battles were emotionally draining, but they also revealed the depth of Karen's manipulation. Witnesses came forward, many of them residents of the neighborhood who had been victimized by Karen in one form or another. One neighbor testified about how Karen had once filed a false complaint about their children playing outside, leading to an investigation that nearly resulted in fines for their family. Another neighbor spoke about how Karen had threatened to have their dog euthanized over a simple misunderstanding. The more the family heard, the more they realized just how far Karen's actions had gone. She wasn't just a bully, she was a predator who had used her position of power to torment anyone who didn't conform to her rigid standards. But it wasn't just Karen who was on trial, it was the HOA as well. As the family's legal team began to investigate further, they uncovered troubling evidence about the association's complicity in Karen's actions. The HOA had been fully aware of Karen's behavior and had failed to intervene or take any meaningful action. Instead of serving the community, the HOA had enabled Karen to act with impunity, ignoring the rights and well-being of the families who were paying dues to live there. The family's lawyer began filing motions against the HOA, accusing them of fostering an environment where Karen's abuse could thrive unchecked. The court case turned into a battle on two fronts, one against Karen's blatant acts of violence, and the other against a corrupt HOA system that had allowed her to carry out her harassment and intimidation without consequence. The family knew that if they were going to win this fight, they had to expose the full extent of the injustice, not just for their daughter, but for every other family that had been bullied or wronged by Karen and the HOA. The emotional toll on the family was undeniable. They were exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. The stress was affecting their health, and the strain was starting to show in their relationships with each other. But despite everything, they refused to give up. They knew that they had a duty to stand up for what was right, to fight for their daughter's future, and to ensure that no one else would have to endure what they had gone through. With each passing day, the family grew stronger. They leaned on each other for support, drawing strength from their shared determination to get justice. Their daughter, though still scarred, began to show signs of resilience. She had moments of laughter, moments where the weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders, and the family knew that, no matter how long it took, they would continue fighting. For their daughter, for their community, and for the truth. The fight for justice wasn't just about winning in the courtroom, it was about reclaiming their peace of mind, their dignity, and their sense of safety. And as the case moved closer to trial, they knew that the final outcome would not only determine Karen's fate, but also the future of their family. The road ahead was long, but they were ready. The fight was far from over, and they would not back down. The day of the trial arrived, a culmination of months of emotional turmoil, frustration, and anticipation. The family, weary but resolute, filed into the courtroom, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had transpired. They had fought tirelessly for justice, not just for their daughter, but for the dignity that had been stripped away from them by Karen's reckless actions and the HOA's inaction. They had relived the horrors of that fateful day over and over again in court, each retelling bringing fresh waves of pain. But they had not wavered. They had stood firm in their resolve. Karen, sitting across from them, showed no remorse. She maintained her cold, calculated stance, still claiming that her actions had been a lesson. The lack of empathy, the complete absence of an apology, it was as if she still believed she had done nothing wrong. The family, in contrast, wore their pain on their sleeves. The daughter, though now recovering physically, was still emotionally scarred. The trauma she had endured would take years to heal, if it ever did at all. But they knew they couldn't let Karen's actions go unchecked. They couldn't allow her to get away with destroying their peace, their safety, and their sense of security. The courtroom drama reached its peak when the final witnesses were called to testify. Neighbors who had been victims of Karen's manipulation and harassment spoke up, recounting how they had been made to feel unwelcome, how they had been forced to live in fear of her constant complaints and threats. Their testimony painted a picture of a woman who had used her position within the HOA to manipulate and control everyone around her. It wasn't just about one shooting, it was about a pattern of behavior, a long history of abuse that had been allowed to fester because the system had failed to stop it. As the trial neared its conclusion, the family's legal team made their closing arguments. They spoke passionately about the injustice that had been done to this family, how a vulnerable child had been harmed by someone who was supposed to be a neighbor, a protector, not a perpetrator. They emphasized how the HOA had failed in its duty to protect the families within the community, choosing to turn a blind eye to Karen's actions. The family, despite everything they had been through, had found the strength to fight, to ensure that the truth came to light, and that those responsible would be held accountable. The judge, after hearing the final arguments, took his time deliberating. The courtroom was silent as everyone awaited his decision. For the family, this was the moment of reckoning. Would Karen be held responsible for her actions? Would the HOA be forced to answer for its role in enabling her? As the judge returned to deliver his verdict, the tension was palpable. When the verdict was finally announced, the family's collective breath caught in their throats. Karen was found guilty, not only of the shooting, but also of harassment, emotional distress, and violation of the HOA's own policies. The judge's words were firm, and the family could sense that justice had been served. Karen would face prison time for her actions, and the HOA would be required to overhaul its practices, ensuring that no other family would ever have to endure what they had. It was a hard-fought victory, but a victory nonetheless. As they left the courtroom, there was a strange sense of closure, though the scars of what had happened would remain for a long time. Their daughter, now more resilient, began to show signs of healing, though it would take time. The family had learned the true value of standing up for what was right, of not allowing fear or intimidation to dictate their lives. They had fought for their daughter's future, and in doing so, they had changed the course of their lives forever. In the months that followed, the family began to rebuild. They moved to a new neighborhood, far from the toxic environment they had once called home. Their daughter, though still haunted by memories of the shooting, found new friends, new opportunities, and a sense of safety she had never known before. The family's bond grew stronger, forged through the fires of adversity, and their hope for the future was renewed. Looking back, the family could reflect on how much they had learned. They had faced a powerful adversary, but they had never lost sight of their goal. They had fought not just for themselves, but for every family who had ever been victimized by someone in a position of power. They had learned the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned the true meaning of resilience. Their daughter had become a symbol of strength, a reminder that even in the face of the worst possible circumstances, there is always hope. And while they knew their lives would never be the same, they also knew that they had emerged from this ordeal stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The family's journey wasn't just about finding justice, it was about reclaiming their peace, their safety, and their future. It was a reminder that no matter the challenges they faced, they would always stand together, fighting for the truth and for the ones they loved. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but they were no longer afraid. They had proven to themselves and to the world that they could overcome anything. As the family stood together in the warmth of their new home, the weight of everything they had endured began to settle. It had been a long, painful journey, one that had tested their strength, their resolve, and their faith in justice. But despite the hardships, they had emerged victorious. The fight for their daughter's dignity and safety had led them through dark, uncertain days, but they had never wavered in their pursuit of truth. The courtroom battle was over, but the emotional healing had only just begun. Their daughter, once traumatized and broken by the events that had shattered their world, was slowly finding her way back. Each day brought a little more peace, a little more light into her life. It wasn't a perfect recovery, and there were still days when the pain resurfaced, but there was hope. There was the promise of a future where she could feel safe again, where she could play freely without fear. For the parents, the road to recovery was equally difficult. They had witnessed their child suffering, felt the sting of helplessness, and fought tooth and nail to reclaim what had been stolen from them. They had faced an adversary who was determined to tear their family apart, but in the end, they had stood united, stronger than ever. The victory in the courtroom was important, but what mattered most was that they had done it together. They had shown their daughter the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the value of never backing down in the face of injustice. As they looked back on the trial, the endless paperwork, and the overwhelming emotions that had accompanied the entire ordeal, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had fought for their daughter's future, And in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of many others in the community. Karen's actions had been exposed for what they truly were, and the HOA had been forced to confront its failures. But perhaps the greatest victory was the message it sent. No one, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, should be allowed to hurt others without consequences. The family story was one of survival, of unbreakable strength, and unwavering love. It was a story of standing tall when everything seemed to be falling apart, of finding courage even in the darkest moments. They had learned the true meaning of justice, not just in the courtroom, but in their hearts. They had learned that justice wasn't just about punishment, but about healing, restoration, and finding peace after a storm. As they moved forward, the family carried with them the lessons they had learned throughout this long and painful journey. They knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. It was a constant pursuit, one that required vigilance, courage, and strength. But they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, the family felt a sense of peace. Their daughter was healing, the scars were slowly fading, and the bond between them had never been stronger. The world may have tried to break them, but they had emerged unbroken, determined to live their lives with courage and conviction. The fight was over, but the family's journey was just beginning. Together, they would move forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because, in the end, they had learned one undeniable truth. No matter how dark the road may be, the light of love, resilience, and justice would always lead the way. Thank you for following along with this powerful story. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, justice, and the fight for what's right, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss the next powerful story we have coming your way. Join the conversation in the comments, share your thoughts, experiences, or simply offer your support. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to like and share this video if you believe in standing up for what's right, because your support helps us spread these stories to others who need to hear them. Until next time, keep fighting for justice and keep watching the HOA stories.